Good evening and welcome to the All-Australian Talk Show, where the talkers are all Australians and the show is all talk. And tonight we have with us someone whose talk can be talked of in the same breath as eloquence, Gough Whitlam. Also talking will be the brilliant legal star of hypotheticals, Geoffrey Robertson. At the moment, they're discussing the finer points of constitutional law outside in the car park in our ABC Hospitality 5-row shed, while they enjoy a plate of lamingtons donated by one of our all-Australian sponsors, Hashatashi Hasty Tasty Canopies for the connoisseur. Yes, once again, we are proud to admit that this public service broadcast could not proceed without substantial help from the private sector, as costs plummet up to meet income soaring down in the sprawling contraction of the J-curve's bottom line. But first, in the ABC's continuing quest ahead of the rest to bring Australia abreast of the best, we give you the edited highlights of today's world news as gathered in by the ABC's ground-based satellite at Gundagai. From London comes the astonishing news that Emperor Hirohito of Japan has gone into exile because of his consuming passion for the Princess of Wales. The runaway emperor has taken out British citizenship and will be allowed to hold the princess's handbag while she dances with John Travolta. In Tokyo, Japanese world domination in the sport of sumo wrestling received a setback today when the 3 top Japanese sumo wrestlers simultaneously lost a contact lens. Canberra and Prime Minister Mr. Robert Hawke, in his role as international statesman at the hub of world events, received the ambassador from Outer Mongolia at the lodge yesterday. Outer Mongolia might take some of the wheat that we can't sell to South Africa because of the sanctions, which won't be applied to South Africa by the United States, but will be selling their wheat cheaply to the Soviet Union when we can't sell ours because it's too dear, the Prime Minister explained. The ambassador's reply is currently being cleaned off Mr. Hawke's suit. As the Australian economy declines, psychologists are worried that the increasing recourse to junk food is having a damaging effect on the intelligence of Australia's youth. The Australian Army, in particular, is concerned about the brain power of its new recruits. They take every order literally, said a spokesman. It's frightening. And more news of how petrol shortages are affecting the performance of the police motorcycle divisions in our major cities. Many police have had their motorcycles replaced with bicycles, but now a rubber shortage means that the bicycles aren't allowed to go anywhere either. So the motorcycle policeman just sits on his bicycle and says, brum, brum, brum. We turn now to things of the mind, the academy, the law, the intricacies of politics. From the dawn of its history until the Whitlam era, of which and whom, more later, Australia exported mental talent so that it might mature abroad and be brought home later, tempered for the struggle. Gifted students went to England on Rhodes scholarships. One famous Australian Rhodes scholar, nervous on his first day in Oxford, was young Robert Hawke. He protectively shielded his vulnerable areas. In more recent times, another famous Australian Rhodes scholar was Geoffrey Robertson, brilliant barrister and presenter of the hit TV program Hypotheticals. He was always asking hypothetical questions, such as, how would an Australian Prime Minister and an ex-Premier of New South Wales react to the news that an economic crisis was about to engulf the country? But one thing that isn't hypothetical about Geoffrey Robertson is the quality of his legal brain. He would have built a glittering reputation in the law, even if he'd just been out for himself. But he's been known to take a case for no fee if he believes a principle is at stake. So I know he won't mind my telling him at this late date that we won't be paying him any appearance money. I'm proud to welcome my gifted contemporary, Geoffrey Robertson. Geoffrey, how do you live with the fact that you're a sex symbol for millions of love-hungry Australian women?
Really? You're telling me that now?
Didn't you know this? I keep
No, I don't. You're the first person to...
I can't say I see it myself.
In
my experience, there's nothing personal, but in my experience, women don't like all that luxury and hair. They go for baldness. How did you discover the idea of hypotheticals?
I discovered the hypotheticals in Harvard in the late 60s. I was dropping in on a little mate from student politics called Nick Greiner. You wouldn't remember him, but he was at Harvard studying how to be Premier of New South Wales. And he was always a terribly lazy student. But when I arrived just before a lecture, his desk was covered with textbooks, the perspiration dripping from his brow, fear in his eyes. I said, come on, Nick, it's only a lecture. He said, no, no, it's a hypothetical. I'm going to run this hypothetical company, and if I don't master every detail of company law, I'm going to be taken over or liquidated or sent to the bottom of the harbour. And I thought this was a pretty good teaching method. So when I started to teach as a visiting professor in England a few years later, I used it. And that was the time when the Ford Foundation and Granada Television were looking for a moderator to present, to adapt the hypothetical which had been used as a teaching tool in Harvard to the television audience, putting real people with real power around the horseshoe table.
And what happened to this obscure person, Greiner?
Well, he's still studying how to be Premier of New South Wales.
He'd have a good chance in any other state, wouldn't he? But here he's up against the glittering personality of Barry Arnsworth. So you did these hypotheticals in English television. Did any of them ever come true?
Sometimes they do become propheticals. A few years ago I did a show for CBS in Britain where I had Alexander Haig and the head of the CIA around the table, and I invented a little scenario of an American invasion of a Commonwealth Caribbean island that had just gone Marxist. And people said, no, never work. Too far-fetched. 2 weeks later, Grenada was invaded. But I do, I suppose, invent tax schemes to tempt businessmen, and a year later you realize they've been sent to jail for them.
You've been living in England for nearly as long as I have, which is 25 years. No? It's quite 15. A while. 15, yeah. Well, that's, you know, in the same order of time. But the difference really is that you actually sound like a, if I may say so, a pom. No.
Well, Private Eye described me as an Australian who's had a voice transplant. But,
did you deliberately learn the accent?
No, it came out this way. I had a speech impediment for many years. I couldn't speak at all. And then it came out like this. And I blame the ABC. I think I was listening to too much ABC radio. I mean, the ABC was our first ethnic broadcaster, translating all those BBC programs to the expatriate British community.
But that was then. You listened to the ABC and you end up with a voice like yours. Nowadays, they listen to Molly Meldrum. Did the voice, this voice which you happened to acquire naturally, did that help your career in England? Did it help to sound like a pom?
I suppose it does, yes, but more important is Oxford. As you know, Oxbridge is the ticket to the establishment, it's the ticket to treason, it's the ticket to... I mean, Cambridge is treason, sodomy, and review scripts.
It's where certainly we've always been where the spies are trained. But could you have made it at the English bar with an Australian accent? Has anyone ever done that?
Not quite, not to my knowledge.
Because killing your accent was what Australians had to do in all fields once.
I don't think they have to do so now. No. I think there's a lot more pride in being Australian and a lot less self-consciousness about it.
A welcome change. What originally made you go to Britain in that case?
Oh, I had a scholarship and a desire to travel, but I also was interested in criminal law, and there wasn't much.
You had the Rhodes Scholarship.
Yes, there wasn't much interest in criminal law in Sydney. I mean, all the interesting criminals were either in state politics or in the police force. There was a dreadful conspiracy of silence in those days. At uni, we all knew that Askin was on the take. We all knew that Fred Cray, who was the pin-up man of the evening newspapers, was a racketeer and a scoundrel. But the press never told us, partly because of the libel law, partly because journalists were cowards.
Yeah. It wasn't just the criminals in New South Wales that drove you away, though, was it? It was... Did Australia stifle you?
I think there was a stifling atmosphere in the Menzies period. I mean, one of our friends was, in fact, a Menzies cabinet minister, and I asked him why the cabinet had banned Lady Chatterley's Lover just after it had been released in Britain. And he said, well, we all read it in the parliamentary library, and we didn't see any harm in it. But then Bob Menzies came into the cabinet room and said, gentlemen, we are not going to allow Dame Patty to read this book. So the Dame Patty test was applied across the board. They even banned the trial of Lady Chatterley.
The book about Lady Chatterley.
The book about the trial.
It was an extraordinary atmosphere in retrospect. It seemed to me normal at the time. Probably a bit more trad.
But why did you take the boat?
That wasn't what sent me away. Even in the 50s, in Melbourne, there was one police inspector who personally used to censor the bookshops. His name was Vogelsang, I remember. And he would go into bookshops and look through the books, and any book he didn't like, he'd get banned. And he picked them up if there was a word in it he thought was offensive. There was one book he picked up and it had the word incest in it, and he had it banned. And the counsel who was trying to defend the book said, "Do you know what incest means?" He said he didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was obscene.
It's still a bit like the British Customs. I was in a case a couple of years ago where they seized books with suspicious titles, and one of them was Fun in Bed, which was a book of games for sick children. And, another was Rape Around Our Coast, which was in fact a serious study of soil erosion in California.
I don't think I left Australia at that time just because I thought it was a stifled, repressive society. It's just that I thought there were opportunities abroad, that's all.
Well, I mean, you came to Cambridge in the 60s with Beyond the Fringe, and the Footlights suddenly started to replay the old Sydney University review scripts about the middle 60s.
I think you're doing a very good job of interviewing me here. You often worked with Rumpel's creator, John Mortimer. Now, how did he discover you?
I discovered him, or I was discovered by a long-haired hippie who was vaguely recognizable as Richard Neville, who'd, of course, been sentenced to prison in Australia for Oz, and the young recidivist had done it again in London. He had produced a cartoon of a much-loved British childhood character called Rupert the Bear. And Rupert the Bear he had endowed with a truly bear-sized sexual organ. And he'd been charged with conspiracy to corrupt the morals of the liege subjects of the Queen, whose minds were open to inordinate and lustful desires, and rampant Rupert in the nurseries of Britain was not something that a lot of Q.C.s wanted to know about. They were all very keen to do the case, and Richard and I went through the temple, showing them giving them the Rupert Bear test. And there was a lot of harumphing and suddenly finding their court diaries were full for the next 2 years. And we did finally find a barrister who giggled. And he was in a restaurant opposite the Old Bailey during a break in a trial where he was defending an axe murderer. He was surrounded by actresses who giggled even more delightedly than he did. And that was John Mortimer. And I worked with John in a lot of cases. He became a sort of forensic father to me, I guess.
I know he thinks a lot of you. I've met him a couple of times. He said that your research is actually what saved them from jail. Actually, you won the case by the amount of research you did.
I think well, I've learnt far more from him, of course. He was a great cross-examiner. He believed, he never bullied. I mean, the traditional barrister gets up and shouts at the witness and bullies the witness into giving the answer that he wants. But John believed there was good in everyone, and the anguish on his face when he had to suggest a policeman was lying made the jury believe, of course, the allegations he was making.
What's the most recent case you've worked on with Mortimer?
Of course, John's retired now. He's hung up his wig. I think we did a case, our last case together was defending a rock group called the Sex Pistols, who'd made an album called Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. And bollocks was alleged to be an indecent word. So we called...
It is an indecent word, isn't it?
Well, wait. We called an expert on English literature to trace for the court the etymology of the word bollocks, how it began in medieval English as the word for testicles. And it was used in Caxton's Bible, in all editions of the Bible, until the King James edition, in that sense. But in the King James edition, it was replaced by the word stones. And at this point, my client, Mr. Johnny Rotten, passed me a note which said, "Don't worry if we lose the case. We'll retitle the album, Never Mind the Stones. Here's the Sex Pistols." Which goes to show the counterproductivity of censorship.
But you were actually claiming that bollocks couldn't be obscene because it meant testicles.
But it was a good old English word. It later got degenerated. There was a character in 18th century literature called Bollocks the Parson. And so it became associated with parsonical, sing-song, chant, cant, and finally rubbish.
What is the law? Is it an ass or is it something you have to love? Or is it both?
It's both. It can be both.
Will there be more hypotheticals?
I hope so. I'd rather like... I keep meeting these people walking around London on bicentennial grounds. I mean, the great bicentennial... the great bicentennial novel is being written in flats in Kentish Town at the moment. But I'd like to do a bicentennial hypothetical, I think. I'd like to replay some of the dilemmas that faced the First Fleet. Perhaps with Bob Hawke as Governor Phillip, and Glenn Murcutt as Francis Greenway, Sergeant Roger Rogerson of the Rum Corps. There'd be no shortage. There'd be no shortage of convicts. We'll have leading Sydney business identities.
Yeah, whom we will not name.
We have Rex Jackson as a ticket of leave man. And we'll have... I don't know how I'd cast Gough. I think maybe if I could get John Kerr to play Fletcher Christian, I'd have Gough as Captain Bligh. But I think now, perhaps, given his new interests, I'd probably cast him as La Perouse. I mean, it was very close. We were almost colonized by the French. I think Philip saw La Perouse as he was sailing out of Botany Bay. La Perouse sailed in. It'd be a very interesting hypothetical question. What would Australia be like had we been colonized by the French?
The first thing it would be a republic, wouldn't it?
Sure.
Probably with Hogan as president. Russ Hinds as Minister of Food.
We could bring back the Bunyip aristocracy. Kate Wentworth as Queen Mother. Right?
John Singleton as Foreign Minister. Like that. Jacko as Minister of Culture. Anyway, there's a lot more we can say on those lines, but we've got a commercial break coming up, so...
on the ABC?
We do. It's a unique feature we have on this program. So for the moment, we have to say thank you very much, Geoffrey Robertson. Geoffrey Robertson will be staying for part 2 of this program, when we'll be joined by Gough Whitlam, who is now in our offset ensuite conference room, being briefed by the ABC's research staff. He'll be joining us after our commercial break, a showcase vignette unique to this program, in which your sales message can reach our poverty-stricken but highly selective ABC audience by means of slides, tastefully tinted and decorously decorated with the relevant rubric. He's not an Australian, or he'd leave it up there. Don't pick your nose in public. In the ABC's new soap opera, a crocodile's face is bitten off and restored by plastic surgery. Crocodile done up. The ABC's new hit album, Molly Meldrum reads aloud from the later novels of Henry James. An inspiration to verbally handicapped people everywhere. Fly Australian Airlines Prime Ministerial Class for the man nobody wants to sit with. Welcome back after our commercial break, which combines with sponsorship to ensure that this ABC program bolsters artistic independence with fiscal realism, the vision of John Milton with the economics of Milton Friedman. During this brief demonstration of how the free market can help to keep standards high, we've been joined by Gough Whitlam, whom I'll ask you to welcome in a moment, but not before I've made a foredoomed attempt to sum up his attainments, his career, and his enormous impact on modern Australian history. Gough Whitlam was born in Mexico and entered Australia as an illegal immigrant. Whitlam met a silver-haired soothsayer who said, one day your job will be taken by a tall, dark, boring grazier who will wreck the Australian economy. But don't worry, I'll fix it. Whitlam's chief political handicap was his name, Gough. Australians pronounced it Guff or Goog or just gave up. So he changed his name to Tim Whitlam. The slogan, it's Tim. The slogan, it's Tim, catapulted Whitlam to power. As Prime Minister, Whitlam displayed legendary powers of eloquence despite a severe handicap. He suffered agonies from spinach caught between his upper front teeth. The soothsayer showed him how to clear away the spinach with secret mouth movements. In Port Moresby, there was a diplomatic incident when the end of Whitlam's tie got stuck in the wax-filled left ear. of Prime Minister Samari. Defeated, Whitlam went into exile in Hawaii, where he was visited by the soothsayer, who asked, "Is this a good place to come to when they finally pull the plug on me?" I hope this resume has done something to simplify the difficult task of reaching a single opinion to fit a multiple man. A distinguished mind passionate for the rights of ordinary people, a modern hero for whom even his enemies must find classical parallels. Is he Pericles or Julius Caesar, Tiger Kelly or Ginger Meggs? The answer is embodied in the man himself, so if we never find out, at least tonight we get close, because he's here. I'm honoured to welcome Gough Whitlam. For the last 3 years you've been living in Paris, I suppose you've had to kiss a lot of people on both cheeks, have you?
The incidence has grown, yes.
How do you stoop down or do you pick them up? Because,
They usually stand on their toes.
but they're used to it because de Gaulle was very tall, wasn't he?
There are similarities, yeah.
Did you ever meet de Gaulle? Could you look him in the eye? Could he?
Of course.
Yeah. How tall was he exactly?
The same.
The same, eye to eye.
Yeah.
Who speaks the best French, you or Margaret?
Each believes that he or she does.
But you've spoken French from an early age, have you not? Did you learn at school?
I learnt it at school, yes, and then didn't speak it for 50 years afterwards.
Was it hard to become proficient in it?
Oh, I'm not claiming to be proficient. I can get by, yeah.
Do the French help you learn the... In my experience, they don't. They're a bit reluctant to let you...
They all want to know what I'm saying.
Yes, I suppose that was the difference. When I asked...
Vive la différence.
I asked a policeman the way once in Paris, and he wanted to see my passport. He wanted to arrest me. He thought my accent was so bad. What do you like most about living in Paris?
It's the best city in the world.
In what respect?
Well, it's got a great history, but also, of course, they look after it so well, and it's a very good city to live in. They certainly look after it better than any people look after any city.
Is that everybody's idea, or has the government imposed this?
For 400 years, all French governments have looked after their capital in a way that, for instance, British governments have never looked after London. The reason being that in Paris, in France, governments are strong enough to control the developers, whereas in London, and maybe in some Australian cities, the developers control governments.
What about, though, in the cases of when the government was very strong and imposed things on Paris, like the Pompidou? Remember the hole Pompidou made in Les Halles?
Yes, yes. But at the same time, more people visit the Pompidou Centre than visit the Louvre. It is a great attraction. And the whole of the surroundings of the Pompidou are packed with people all the time. French people as well as overseas.
I like it too. Part of the fun of the building is that, which I suppose some people in the audience haven't been there, or indeed haven't even seen a photograph of it, but it looks like a vast set of pipes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You see the skeleton of the building completely. That's the fun of it, probably.
All the sewage pipes are from exterior.
Different colours and all...
transparent and all.
Yeah, well, I know. But they're decently painted.
But part of the fun of the place is watching it disintegrate as you walk through it, don't you think? I mean, it is falling apart already, is it not?
They'll keep it together. But by comparison with London, for instance, they're so frozen. They daren't build new buildings. They daren't adapt present ones.
Sometimes they get stopped. The Prince of Wales personally put a stop to an extension to the National
Gallery.
It would have been a disaster. Really.
Oh yes, I'm not suggesting that it wouldn't have been. But
I'm merely putting it to you as a hypothetical.
Yeah.
That this strong centralised government you favour can occasionally make a mistake and inflict it on the people.
But London is full of great spots, but they're quite uncoordinated and it's quite difficult to get from one to the other. Whereas in Paris, everything is well maintained and well connected.
Including the Underground Railway. Do you travel?
Superb, yeah. At the weekend I do.
Yeah. You find your way around on the metro? It's a real...
Yes. But Margaret does the whole time. She does in the weekdays also.
It's a fabulous system, isn't it?
Superb.
I like the one with the rubber wheels that runs down under the
Absolutely.
Champs-Élysées.
It runs quite near our palace.
And you can't even hear it coming. I thought I'd gone deaf the first time I came into this town. You like Paris?
Love it. It's all true. I mean, I just wish we had a
yeah.
Laurie Brereton in London to build a monorail across the channel. The British are very nervous about even touching
Yes,
France.
yeah.
I mean, the channel, they're now talking about a Brunel, which will be half bridge, half tunnel. But and the Agincourt mentality is still strong. They've never forgiven Joan of Arc.
Living in Europe, do you get the impression that Australia is of minor importance on the world stage?
I think it's of minor interest to Europe. But I suppose as far as the general public's concerned, as far as the media are concerned, New Zealand at present is of more interest in Europe than is Australia.
I think the general...
That is, Longy is a bigger public figure, a bigger world figure than Hawke.
I get the impression that the general opinion of Australia is people are becoming more and more fascinated. The British people especially are fascinated by Australia.
Well, a great number of young French people are fascinated by Australia, the sheer space and the freedom that goes with it.
And even America knows where Australia is now. There was a time when they physically didn't know where it was.
Yeah. Oh, they treat us as they treat all their allies.
But it's increasingly rare out there in the world now to meet people who get Australia mixed up with Austria, as I once did with an American. You really didn't know the difference about it. I'd just like to know what's created...
Well, it still happens in Paris. You still get deliveries to the two places mixed.
But the French are a peculiarly chauvinist nation, are they not?
Yes, probably. They have a very great self-esteem, yes.
What happens in the diplomatic conversation when you drop words like Mururoa or Rainbow Warrior?
Ah, well, I don't have to come into that. That's the ambassador to France does that. I'm more multilateral or international.
But you never mention it at all.
Yes, it does come up, but more particularly, New Caledonia comes up. And you can get people of a very wide political spectrum in France resenting what we're doing to support self-government and independence for the people who were born in New Caledonia. Not the imported majority, but the people who were born there.
But they read all about it in their excellent newspaper. They're very well informed, aren't they, through the press?
On those parts of the world which have had connections with France, such as the whole of Northwest Africa, the whole of it, and Vietnam, then unquestionably the French newspapers are very much better informed than any of the English language newspapers anywhere.
Is that the main difference between the French European press and ours, is just the sheer level?
Well, some of the newspapers are written in a very stylish fashion. You know, you still
Le Monde is wonderful.
You still get essays written by journalists in the newspapers.
Yeah. Well, people try that here, but it's less of a way of life here, isn't it?
Yes, very. Well, of course, we have a much more limited press because there are so few owners. Whereas, of course, in France and in England, or to put it bluntly, in Paris and in London, there is still a very great variety of ownership and therefore variety of view. And we do suffer in Australia, unquestionably, from the fact that we have very few newspaper owners and they own papers in different states.
Well, the power's concentrated in too few hands. It's
Yes.
inherently an abuse.
Yes. And this is a difficulty, whereas in England, it's very much more likely that you will get minority views or varying views made available in the daily papers.
It's also increasingly likely that papers in England will be taken over by Australian newspaper proprietors. The Australian press laws are operating on a world scale.
Well, they become American, actually.
Well, Murdoch became American.
And the Canadians and the Americans own the big London newspapers.
In fact, Murdoch is probably ready to adopt any nationality in order to take over newspapers in any country.
Thank God he only speaks English.
Come on, he's a great Australian in the sense that Attila was a great Hun.
Yes, but
Tell us about this Constitutional Commission. Is it at last going to get rid of the anomaly that dissed your government, really?
I think we will probably be tackling this question of the Senate being able to hold up the House of Representatives. I mean, after all, if our Constitution had been framed after the British limited the power of the House of Lords in 1911, there's no doubt that we would have had a limit in that respect on our Senate. And of course the New South Wales Legislative Council had limits placed on its power to hold up money bills back in 1934. So I would hope that our Constitutional Commission will make that basic updating, that it's not possible for the Senate to hold up things any more than it's possible for the Lords or the New South Wales Legislative Council.
Isn't the anomaly, as you stated it in your book, that there was a monarchical system in which the monarchy did not have a voice, in other words?
Yes, well, of course, that was brought to a head by the situation I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
That where the Senate had refused to pass money bills for the first time since the Constitution was done 3/4 of a century before, the Queen's representative stepped in a way that the Queen would never have done if she'd been here, or than she would ever be tempted to do in Britain where she lives. But there is, as you say, that basic trouble about the monarchy. And we have a monarchy, and the monarch can't do her job because she can't live here.
Sure.
There's another thing, that the representational aspect, if the Queen goes abroad anywhere to one of her realms, she is always seen as Queen of England, Queen of the United Kingdom. Even if she visits Papua New Guinea, she's never seen as Queen of Australia. Or if she visits Australia, coming from Papua New Guinea, nobody thinks that she's been there as Queen of Papua New Guinea. She visits both places as Queen of England. So the ceremonial role that monarchs can perform is denied to Australia by its monarchy.
So it's not the Queen you're trying to get out of the picture, it's the fact that the representative can actually interfere in Australian politics because of this
I
reform.
think the Queen does a superb job as head of state in the United Kingdom. She's the most experienced head of state in the world. She's a very well-informed, conscientious person. And but that doesn't mean that I have to pretend that she can do a job in Australia. She can only do a job in Australia as a visitor. Now, there's no doubt that if she was living here, she would do the job better than any Governor-General or the host of governors that represent her. But she can't. That's the practical situation. The head of the Commonwealth, which she would remain when we become a republic, doesn't have any power in any of the countries of that, but she can only have constitutional powers in Britain.
Geoffrey, you're not too hot on the monarchy anyway.
Well, I've been a Republican a lot longer than Gough. I mean, you date your republicanism from when was
From
it? November the 11th, 1975.
That's true, that's true.
I date mine from about the age of 6, when I was one of thousands of school children who were dragged out to the Sydney Showground in the boiling heat. 3 hours we stood and fainted in the sun, and then in the distance the Royal Jeep could be hove into view.
It was a Land Rover. I was there.
It was a Jeep, and we got
still British, isn't it, Land Rover?
Land Rover.
a limp wave of the wrist. Where were you? You were in the shade, obviously.
She did very well. They were late. There were thousands of us there, all standing in the showground with little flags.
That's right. That's right. Did you find the toilet?
She was at least I stayed upright. A lot of children fainted. I admit some of them fainted. Yes. But she was late. She was unavoidably delayed. So when the Land Rover arrived, it was doing 80 miles an hour. And, it went past us like a bullet. But she was holding on a hat. I thought she behaved very well, and he saluted. But I was so self-conscious, I could feel her eyes on me as I waved my little flag.
I couldn't feel her eyes on mine. She obviously
maybe
turned in the wrong direction. You've been a royalist ever since.
It's a temperamental difference. Some of us are born conservative and others not.
I've always thought, obviously, in theory, that monarchy was a ridiculous and elitist form of government. But it didn't worry me because the monarch didn't live here. But of course, when I realised that the monarchy could be manipulated here by dishonourable representatives, then I changed my mind.
Well, it's an intellectual's view. It's the reason why I distrust anti-monarchist views is that it is an intellectual view, and that is elitist. Whereas ordinary people, a lot of ordinary people in Australia are very fond of it.
Sure, I mean, we all watch the the royal wedding, and we watched it with Sir Alistair Burnet, not with Ray Martin. It was...
And you watch it with Maggie Tabor and the Women's Weekly and every Australian publication, and people are very... People are very... She loved it. She was there, in fact.
It wouldn't stop people watching, wouldn't stop people any more than they watch Dallas or Dynasty.
Do you really think...
Soap opera is...
Do you really think you could get legislation which made Australia a republic? Could it happen? You really... I know this is
you'd have to alter the constitution, which really means you'd have to have a referendum. But of course, the public opinion polls that are asked on this always assume that when we become a republic, we have to dissociate ourselves from Britain and from other Commonwealth countries. That, of course, is sheer nonsense, because there are at least twice as many republics in the Commonwealth as there are countries of which the Queen is head of state. On top of that, there are several other monarchies in the Commonwealth. The King or Queen of Britain could still be head of the Commonwealth.
You've always enjoyed good relations with the royal family, haven't you? And you went to dinner at the palace? Did you have dinner at the palace?
No, at Windsor.
Windsor.
We've had lunch at the palace.
Lunch. How did the Queen's corgis behave?
I did, in fact, recite on one occasion the experience with the corgis at a lunch at Buckingham Palace. And after lunch, the Queen, who was very fond of the corgis, was sitting on the sofa and I was at the other end, and she was playing with a particular three-legged corgi, I remember. And it obviously distressed itself. Not substantial, but palpable nonetheless. And this was a party gathering that I was describing this, and I was comparing Her Majesty with my own consort. And I said, my dear Margaret would have immediately said, get outside, you dirty thing. Whereas the Queen went on as if nothing had happened. Now, I thought that did show real style. I was wondering if I should say, oh, pardon me, but no, nothing happened. And the dog obviously had offended.
I suppose there's no real point being Queen unless you can sort of sit there and let your corgi do what it wants.
Well, she showed no awareness of its conduct, nor, of course, did I. There was a bit of crescendo in the conversation.
I wonder what they said after you left. They probably said, well, he passed the corgi test. Because they could be very tough, the royals, you know. I met Phil the Greek once, actually.
The Greeks don't refer to him that way.
No, but Barry Mackenzie started it, and I've rather caught the habit. He's a tough customer, in my view.
He married well.
It was the Royals were touring California, which wasn't part of the Commonwealth, but I'm not so sure that Phil the Greek was aware of that. Anyway, it was raining, and they were very brave. They wore raincoats, and it rained on them, and the press wrote all about it. And I was in the press corps, so we were, one day on the tour, the whole press corps was introduced to the Royals, and we met them on the yacht, Britannia.
Yeah.
And I was introduced as a journalist from Australia, and the Duke of Edinburgh says, "My God, a journalist and an Australian." He's not nice, is he?
He is not as sure of himself as she is. After all, she knew that she was important. He didn't know so until he married her.
Well, the next slide, I think the Queen Mum has done a fantastic job of ensuring this dynasty of this, which is obviously going to go into the next generation with flying colours. The Prince of Wales...
That's fine for Britain.
And maybe here, the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales in particular, much loved here. No? Is this not a fair assessment? I'm just guessing.
There's obviously people take very great interest in them when they visit, but I would believe it's quite wrong to say that people really see Prince Charles or Princess Charles as having any role in Australian public life.
Would you better...
They are interesting and welcome visitors.
Would you bet a referendum on it, Geoffrey, yourself, if you were Prime Minister? Would you?
I don't know. I came out in 1975 to cover the elections, which you lost, for the New Statesman. And I made some predictions about your future. I said you'd never be Prime Minister again. I said you'd probably go off and teach at Harvard, which you did. I said Bob Hawke would be the next Labour Prime Minister. And I said in the fullness of time, the wheel would turn a full circle and you'd be appointed Governor-General.
He's a soothsayer.
Would you accept?
Well, I'd wait till I'm asked. I doubt whether Bob Hawke would be asking me. And I don't think it's much more likely that anybody on the other side of politics. But let me say, if I was offered the job and accepted it, I would do it as well as anybody who's ever had it.
I don't doubt it. And that's a very good hypothetical to end the show on, which I'm afraid we have to do because we just run out of airtime. So I have to say thank you very much, Gough Whitlam. And thank you very much, Geoffrey Robertson. And that has to be all from this historic edition of the ABC programme that brings the fertile manure of the Australian economy to the sensitive plant of public service broadcasting, nourishing its roots so that the stem might put out leaves on which advertisements can be strategically placed for all Australian firms with a true interest in our heritage. Geoffrey Robertson's hair design was by Toyota Tonsorial Triumphs of Tempe and Toowoomba. Gough Whitlam's transport arrangements while in Sydney were by Banzai Bonza bandwagons for the bigwig, distended Datsuns with deferential drivers, all major credit cards accepted. My suit was a Russ Hinz original from Kawabatsu Cast-Offs of Cabramatta. And we end with a news flash. Due to be completed in time for the bicentenary, Australia's new Parliament House in Canberra has a faulty front wall. The wall threatened to collapse until Prime Minister Hawke, concerned about unemployment, hired 3 out-of-work Melbourne footballers to hold it up.